Welcome back to Marketing Careers Uncovered. I've personally had a bit of a love-hate relationship with books over the years, particularly those that are often business and self-development orientated. There's a lot floating about, and without an abundance of time, it can be really, really hard to pick out the good from the bad and the stuff that's really going to make a difference to my life and my career. My guest today is Matt Watkinson, and he's someone who I followed on LinkedIn for quite some time. He's someone who's shared quite thought-provoking wisdom in this whole realm of business, customer experience, and life. He's published 3 books alongside developing a successful consulting career, but it was really his latest book, Mastering Uncertainty, that I found a real game changer for me on quite a few different levels. Thanks, Matt, for joining us today. Just before we dive into the detail, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to?
Where to begin? I've written 3 books, 3 business books. First, The 10 Principles Behind Great Customer Experiences in 2013. Well, written before then, but published 2013. Second, The Grid, a book on systems thinking for decision-making in business. And third, Mastering Uncertainty with my co-author, Chaba Concoy, who's a great friend of mine, which is, as the title suggests, about how to make decisions or, more importantly, thrive in an uncertain and unpredictable world, which is the one we live in. I co-founded a design consulting firm and design agency in 2017 with my best friend Ben, and that's what occupies the vast majority of my time. I live in Venice Beach, California, and the rest of my time is taken up by parenting and odd personal projects like restoring this massive Airstream that's sitting on the driveway at the moment.
Very good. Winding the clock back a bit, how did your career get started? Did you have a conscious game plan in mind about what you wanted to do, and what really got your foot in the door and set you off?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways I could go about answering that. I would say primarily that I knew the kind of thing I wanted to do, but maybe not necessarily the exact thing. I think I would have been very happy in a number of different careers or pathways that had similar characteristics. Probably been very happy as an architect, probably been very happy as a car designer or industrial designer, probably have been fairly happy in a number of adjacent disciplines, advertising perhaps, or whatever. So I guess I always knew I wanted to do something, I suppose, creatively inclined that had elements of synthesis of design and problem solving and technology and creativity and that sort of thing. But I ended up being a web designer, designing websites and software as a kind of UX, UI designer. And then as more channels and touch points came into the mix, for the clients that I was working for, the challenge was no longer how do we have a good website, how do we have a good contact center, how do we have a good app. It was more how do we start joining these things together into a more kind of cohesive and coherent overall experience for the customer. So that's how I found myself working in that field of thinking about the bigger customer experience and not just the digital side of things, even though the digital stuff is still, the kind of bread and butter of the business. That's the kind of first 10 years, I guess, career-wise. I got started because I was fortunate to cross paths with somebody who gave me an intro to a guy called Ed Texier, who was starting his own agency kind of out in the sticks. And I was a student at university and I was looking for some work or a kind of internship. And it just happened to be that the stars aligned and I ended up working for him, and he was a tremendous mentor and friend. And, I learned a lot from him in a very short period of time, which allowed me basically to go straight into a contracting career as soon as I left university. So I was very fortunate in that regard.
So very much making the most of fortuitous encounters as well, which sort of brings us on to what we're talking about today, which is your latest book, Mastering Uncertainty. And it'd be useful if you can, without reading it cover to us, which I'm sure we'd love but don't have the time for. Could you just give us a little bit of a flavour of the central premise behind your book?
I suppose you could say that the central premise of the book is that the world is more uncertain or more unpredictable than we perhaps like to think about or acknowledge, and that a lot of our success, I suppose, or perhaps more broadly, well being, for want of a better term, is determined by our relationship with that uncertainty, and that that's something that you can work on, it's something that you can consider, it's something that you can adjust, and that that will set you up for greater success in the long term. In fact, you could almost argue that nothing is more central to your ability to thrive than your relationship with or understanding of uncertainty, but it's not something that a lot of people think about. Or if they do think about it, they tend to think about it as something bad, which really it isn't actually. The fact that the world is uncertain, the fact that the future isn't already written means that we get to be the ones that shape it. Right? You can't really believe in a certain future and free will, for example. They're mutually incompatible concepts, right? You either have the will to shape your life in the direction that you're going in, you either have agency to make decisions, or you believe that the world is certain and predictable. You can't believe both. And I think if most people were given a choice, they'd much rather have the ability to shape their own future than they would to believe that everything was predetermined and predictable. But again, these are things that people don't often always think about. They're not consciously aware of their attitude to or relationship with uncertainty and how that affects their decision making. So, yeah, the aim of the book was to just to try and help people make better decisions by appreciating that a little more.
And what if sparked is the right term here? What sparked that thinking that got you ultimately putting pen to paper, after your previous two books, which were quite different actually in nature, really.
Well, all of my writing is really just following my nose, I suppose, intellectually, or it's a book is really putting a capstone on a period of intensive learning and knowledge development and growth. The first book was about principles because which work extremely well within a domain. And my domain happened to be customer experience. And I felt like I understood the principles of that very well and that people would benefit from having a concise primer on them. Uh, as my work shifted to working across kind of domains rather than just within one very narrow area, it became clear that business is a system. So being able to think in terms of systems is advantageous. And the second book, The Grid, was really about helping people to try and think in systems, which is still something that you don't see many people doing, that is extremely important and valuable. Mastering Uncertainty came about because of the intersection of several events or developments, I suppose. One of which was realizing that when you start to think in systems, you realize that whenever you're dealing with a complex adaptive system like a business, or you're part of the economy, or you're part of society or social systems, behaviors are often emergent and highly unpredictable, which means that in reality, we're always kind of making decisions in a probabilistic manner rather than in a kind of deterministic manner. But my observation was that I and 99% of other people that I crossed paths with in the workplace didn't think in those terms. We tended to think of business as a kind of intellectual contest or conquest rather, where the more data you gathered and the more intelligent you were and the more rigorous you were strategically, the more you would be able to eliminate uncertainty, which isn't really true. Certainly not when you're trying to do anything new or or innovative. Right? So it was really a recognition of the limits of my own worldview and the limits of my own thinking and my own development that spurred it, which happened to be catalyzed by meeting Chaba, who became a very good friend and a mentor of mine, who was, an extremely successful investor and an entrepreneur of his own right, and whose thinking was radically different to mine in that he had already recognized the kind of probabilistic nature of decision making. And so I was able to take his philosophy or ideas, for want of a better term, and expand those into a book that I thought would really help people.
Let's take a little look at the actual process of actually putting a book together. Being your third time round, you're probably a bit of a dab hand at this now. But I'm quite intrigued to understand, how you actually go about the process. Is it as straightforward as just letting those ideas flow out of your head, or is there a little bit more of a defined process that you go through to get a book from idea to on the shelf?
Yeah, there's definitely a process to it. I suppose you could break it down into several phases. So the first would be the formation of the concept or idea for the book itself, exactly as you would have if you were taking any other product to market. Who is this for? What problem does it solve? What are the basic parameters of it? What's the competition? Why me? Why us? Why would anyone want to read it? Everything that you would do if you were formulating the value proposition for any other type of product or service. The culmination of that phase would typically be a proposal, which is the book in miniature, and a synopsis. And in many ways, that's actually the hardest part. And it's certainly extremely time consuming. I think when I did the proposal for the grid, it took me over a year to get it right. And several different iterations before my agent was happy enough with it to want to take it to publishers. So, yeah, hopefully the culmination of that phase is an accepted proposal and a publishing deal if you're going down the mainstream route. But if you're self-publishing, I still think it's worth doing that step because it helps you develop your structure, which is the most important thing. So, yeah, then when you go into preparing the manuscript itself, I like to structure it as well as I can up front, kind of like doing the outline of a jigsaw puzzle. It just makes everything easier. People who tend to skip that phase often find that they end up writing themselves into a hole and giving up. So structuring a book and writing a book of two very, very different tasks. And investing time in getting the structure right is, to me at least, hugely important. So, yeah, structural development, what's going in, what are the chapters, what's going in each chapter, and then drafting the manuscript, chapter by chapter. That would culminate in a completed manuscript along with everything else you need to go with that, like obviously all your citations and references, table of contents, that sort of thing. And then the third major phase would be editing. Editing typically is as time consuming as writing the first draft. Most people don't realize that, but it's a hugely time consuming process, and a great editor is kind of worth their weight in gold because they're looking at it completely fresh, whereas you're kind of exhausted and jaded by having gone through the entire process. So, yeah, typically the end of the editing phase would be a set of proofs where it's actually laid out how it will look in the book. Then you go into production, which is cover design, finalizing any title or subtitle, the blurb that's going to go on the back, gathering endorsements for the jacket, and all of that kind of stuff, which also can be very hard. Like writing a blurb is really, really difficult. And then the culmination of that is a finished article of the book. The phase that overlaps but kind of comes after that is the sale of foreign rights to other publishers around the world who might want to publish that book in their country or their language. And obviously, then you at the same time you're also into huge efforts for marketing and promotion, and trying to raise awareness and to get people to buy and read it. So it's certainly a significant undertaking. It's very time consuming, but it can be very rewarding if people write to you and say, "This book helped me," or "I love this book," or "I found this concept really interesting," or you changed my perspective on A, B, or C. Then it's very gratifying.
And do you get a sense quite early on as to how successful something's going to be in the market? Do you get a sense from your publisher, or as it starts to go? How early do you pick up whether it's whether a book is landing well or not in the market?
I honestly don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it. I have to be honest. If you look at how well books sell and when they sell well and how long their shelf life is, it's really wildly unpredictable. I mean, James Clear has sat at the top of the charts with Atomic Habits for I don't know how long. Is it 2 years? And Atomic Habits is a good book. It's a great book, and James Clear is a wonderful writer. But he's not a million times better at writing than somebody somebody who's like 20th in the charts. There's a lot of books like Robert uh, Robert Cialdini. I think that's how you pronounce his surname. His book Influence, was a total non-starter, and then Charlie Munger read it and recommended it, and suddenly it became a bestseller. Um, One of my favorite books, Barbarian Days. They sold the rights in the UK, I think, for £2,000, and then it won a Pulitzer Prize and went bananas. Went flew off the shelves. It was on Barack Obama's summer reading list. So book sales are very fickle and unpredictable things, and I don't think there's a straight line between anything and anything when it comes to book sales in terms of volume and merit or anything else. It's a pretty weird world to be in.
So perhaps not the thing to focus on and fixate on as you're going through the process. Really,
Oh God! I mean, I don't think you can even.
it's not why you do it, is it? Really,
The only thing that you can control is the process, and the outcome is up to everybody else. Really, I don't think I write the books that I wish I'd been able to read, and if other people feel the same way, that's great, and if they don't, they don't. That's not to say I'm not as reader centric, I guess, in my approach as I can be, because I do strive to write something that deserves to be read. I do strive to gather feedback from a brain trust of people who represent the readership on their opinion on the book. I do try to use the clearest and most concise language and write things that are a joy to read for the reader rather than a pain in the ass. I do all of those things, of course I do, but fundamentally I'm writing the book that I want to write in the hope that other people like it.
I struggle quite a lot with a lot of business books, really, and the things that turn me off quite often are actually the things that are the sales hooks attached to them. So, plenty of pieces that claim to have some sort of revelatory insight. There's one single thing you should do to succeed or win in the market or whatever. But actually, often, it's quite a nice academic read, but doesn't the principles don't really survive the cold light of day. What really struck me when reading through Mastering Uncertainty, there are a couple of sections like the 10 paths to growth or managing the uncertainties of entrepreneurship. They were a couple of areas that jumped out to me. A lot of those suggestions laid out, like proactively managing prices or prioritizing revenue growth or systematically dismantling purchasing and adoption barriers. Yeah, but there was nothing that I would call fundamentally revelatory. I never sat there and go, "Gosh, I never thought of proactively managing prices or dismantling adoption barriers." Yeah, but what I'm curious to hear from you is why do you think that we've veered so far from what we just call sensible, measured thinking?
Well, I don't know that common sense has ever been common practice, and I think the value of cogent kind of frameworks or checklists is that they remind you of the things that you know and that they avoid you making fucking stupid mistakes, right? Like if you look at, there's a wonderful example of this. The World Health Organization introduced a basic checklist for surgeons that included things like, have you got the right patient? Have you got the right leg? Have you left any equipment inside the patient? Stuff like that. And it reduced death in caused by surgical complications by a third in the hospitals where they piloted it. Right? So these are some of the most highly trained professionals in the world, and they're making mistakes all the time. Really basic mistakes. If you look at any high performance organization or culture that values things like safety or whatever, they have checklists. A pilot runs a checklist before they take off in an aeroplane. It's not because they don't know how to fly a plane, it's because people are error prone and there's too much to hold in your head at any one time. So having it written down and having it in a neat structure or having it in a checklist allows you to think in a systematized and structured way that makes your outcomes more likely, makes your decision making more effective.
That was wonderful timing. Hearing that aeroplane go past just as you were talking about that.
Of course, you can read a chapter that says you need to be systematized about lowering adoption barriers, and it can list the types of adoption barriers that you can encounter and tell you how to lower them, and say, well, that's very obvious. Well, it's obvious when it's written on the page. What's not obvious is why you're not doing it. Because I've never worked with a client who's systematized and structured about lowering adoption barriers. Not in 20 years. Yeah, I had to write it because it didn't exist. And there's a big difference between. In fact, I would often argue that when it comes to business and non-fiction, much of the best writing makes things seem obvious to you that you couldn't yourself have articulated. If I'd asked you before you'd read Mastering Uncertainty to tell me what the 10 most prevalent adoption barriers were and how you were systematically lowering them, I'm not sure you'd have been able to do it.
No, but once I see it, I'll go, that switch flicks, and I go, yeah, of course I know that.
Yeah, but they're not the same thing. So I don't. I think it's easy to read things that make sense and say that makes sense or that's obvious, but it's only obvious in retrospect, and it's not. And hindsight isn't foresight. And I also think that people are perennially distracted from the fundamentals of their business anyway. Like they're always looking for new, exciting shit to play around with, and typically it's at the expense of the things that actually matter.
Yeah,
You
which
know,
are often not the sexiest things in the world.
almost by definition, not the sexiest things in the world.
What I found after reading Mastering Uncertainty, that the title itself, it's not about just being quite passive and letting the world wash over you, really, is it? I mean, I've very, very quickly found that one of the questions that you posed, which is what's my downside, yeah, has actually fast become a question and mantra that I'm starting to use more and more. But are you approaching anything differently since you wrote and published the book?
Well, I mean, yeah, certainly since I became cognizant of the concepts and the ideas in the book, I had to learn them myself before I could write about them, and learning them dramatically changed my behavior. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I would say of the three books, it's the one that's most upended my personal decision making, or being the greatest catalyst for my own development. Absolutely. Yeah, and that example that you use is a very good one. Like, what's my downside? I think that's a really, really powerful reframing of how we can make decisions, moving away from trying to guarantee an upside to giving ourselves exposure to upside but not being wedded to it. I think asking what's my downside is probably the single most powerful question you can ask yourself in most situations. I mean, it expands your scope of opportunity exponentially.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it was the question I asked before I asked you to come on to come on here. Actually, what's my downside to asking you to come on my podcast? Well, the worst you'd say is, "I'm all right, thank you," and then I would get on with my life and go and ask someone else. Yet here we are having this conversation.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of things in life where there is really no downside whatsoever to trying, or notional downside, but where the upside, should you succeed, is potentially incalculable. And that's not how we're taught to make decisions, but it's how we should make decisions because it's more compatible with the real world.
While we're talking about the real world, I think a situation and a place that most people find themselves are in organisations or teams that can often think very conservatively, risk manage for life and innovation out of everything. Yeah, everything's got to have an ROI attached, and very, very much the brakes are put on any form of wild thinking. But if I'm in that if I'm in that sort of environment, what are some of the things that I could start doing to shift mindsets beyond slipping a copy of Mastering Uncertainty under everyone's chair?
I don't really think about it in those terms. I don't really think about how I would change a massive, unwieldy bureaucracy because I certainly don't think it can happen from the middle or bottom up, and I certainly don't think it can happen from the outside in with advice. I think when you're dealing with large organizations that are very conservative, they change when the pain of staying the same is less than the pain of changing, and they change when the leadership changes or there's a kind of board revolt, or most often actually they surrender their adaptive capacity and lose their standing. I don't have the aspiration, particularly to change big sleepy companies, because they're good at being big sleepy companies. If you're in a stable large category, they're very good at what they do, but they're not good at the other stuff, which is why we have competition and why there's always entrepreneurial or economic opportunity. So I don't really aspire to change those things. And I think if people want to operate in a world where they can be entrepreneurial, where they can have autonomy, where they can take more risk, they need to find a company where they can do that.
And actually, now you mentioned that, thinking back to some of my particularly earlier career, where I felt this almost that I had to be the one pushing and driving and changing things. And if I'd have sought out a firm or people that were more aligned, probably with my worldview, then I might have saved myself a whole lot of stress and discomfort, and probably been much happier, much earlier on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just don't think you should Yeah, asking me that the question is a little bit like saying, well, how can I turn my oil tanker into a speedboat? You don't, any more than you turn a speedboat into an oil tanker, or you turn a dragster into a rally car, or choose your analogy kind of thing. I just don't think it works that way. I mean, I think every individual should be aware of these things, and then they can make the decisions that suit themselves. Or the leaders of organizations should look at the behaviors that they reward and incentivize, and how they structure their organizations to facilitate uh, certain behaviors or certain outlooks or certain more kind of entrepreneurial characteristics. But I don't. I think it would be grotesquely naive of me to think that you can write a book and all of a sudden you're going to change how massive sleepy bureaucracies work. I just don't think that's realistic.
If only it were that easy. We've touched on this a little bit already, but yeah, it really struck me that the book itself isn't really just useful in the context of being part of high performing successful teams or businesses. There was quite a few life lessons in there too. What sort of things are you starting to approach differently, sort of outside of work and in your personal life, having gone through the process?
I think it's a combination of things. I think part of it is validating things that we do instinctively, but that maybe we've been taught to second guess about how we manage relationships, how we treat other people, what we value in our dynamics with other people. And I think part of it is learning new concepts or ideas that come about from a different worldview. Right? So I think in my personal life, I think I've always been a fairly astute relationship manager in terms of trying to create value for other people, try to be more of a host than a guest, try to treat every relationship as a long-term investment. I think and in fact, I think humanity in general instinctively does those things when you're left to your own devices and you're decoupled from the need to be efficient. And then I think there's other stuff like, what's your downside? Um, Addressing things like fear of failure and just being willing to give things a go and be open minded and be forgiving when you make mistakes. That is a fairly radical departure for me in my personal life that has been really liberating and fulfilling. I don't think I'd have embarked on many of the personal projects that I have, like some of the motorcycles I've built or this Airstream that I'm renovating now, if I was carrying that kind of certainty mindset around with me versus more of a kind of growth or probabilistic mindset of, well, let's try it, let's learn, let's accept that the price of learning is often failure and setbacks, and let's just keep going. I think that's been really liberating for me in my personal life as much as it has my professional life.
Brilliant. And finally, what's next for you? You got any more books in you at all?
I have no plans to write any other books at the moment. The only thing I'm writing is I'm writing a series of letters to my son of just life advice that I've picked up along the way. Um, I've almost done 100 letters to him this year. But that's just a kind of ad hoc, when the mood takes me kind of thing. I don't have an ambition behind it other than to just try and pass on some things that I've learned along the way. I mean, having read 500 or 600 books on this sort of stuff, it's be good to give my kid a shortcut if I can. Other than that, just building my design business, and got my hands full with these other personal projects and hobbies that I have, and yeah, life in general. But no grandiose ambitions or plans for a fourth book or anything like that. Just kind of ticking over, really.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for joining me today. Appreciate your time. And if you haven't already, Do subscribe to receive further episodes as they land. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, please share or leave a review. And I'll see you next time.